Welcome back to another video, and we're moving this week into Luke chapter 18 and reading the first 8 verses of that chapter. So here we go. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, "In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, 'Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come back and attack me.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?'" Back in the 1970s on Radio 1, the now disgraced DJ Dave Lee Travis used to invite frustrated wives to send in stories of DIY jobs that their husbands had either failed to do or to complete. Should their story be read on air, Travis sent them a circular object known as a round to it, for when their husbands got around to it. Perhaps stories like that encapsulate the unhelpful stereotype of nagging women. And if you read today's scripture superficially, you may think it's about a nagging woman, the widow who wears down the unjust judge. But that is to ignore the very first sentence of the reading. Read it again to you. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. The theme is not nagging, but don't give up in prayer. And if we pay attention not simply to that first sentence generally, but to the very first word, we realize we need to take into account the context. The first word is then. Luke is telling us that this is related to what has just gone before in his gospel. Now, we didn't read that, but let me point you to the way near the end of the previous chapter that Jesus is in discussion with his disciples who are longing for the fact that he will come again, but who will not live to see it. So Luke 17:22 leads on to quite a lengthy passage. And in that verse, Jesus said to his disciples, "The time is coming when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, but you will not see it." As the widow longed for justice, so there are many who long for the justice of God. But we shall only see it fully when Christ appears again in glory. So, why in the parable is the woman in need? The scholar Ian Paul, whom I often quote, lists 3 signs in the parable of her need. First, he says she has to represent herself. Courts were normally the province of men, and it appears she has no male relative who will represent her. Second, she has to return continually, which means that she doesn't have the financial resources to offer a bribe and have her case settled quickly. That was not an unusual thing then. It isn't unusual in many courts around the world today. Third, she appears to have been denied justice, and the implication is that she's perhaps been deprived of her rights in her inheritance. It might be she's been deprived of her living from her late husband's estate. Now that's quite a list, isn't it? No professional representation, a corrupt legal system, and no financial support. How extraordinary that she is not cowed by her circumstances, but is feisty enough to demand justice. She takes responsibility and takes the initiative in her relentless quest for justice. And as such, she is an example for us. We may not face the same set of personal challenges as her, but there are so many terrible things in our world that we long to see changed. And so, caring about justice can be disheartening. But just when we feel tempted to draw the curtains, curl up in a ball, eat comfort food, and ignore the wicked world outside our door, the widow in the parable says no. She's not going to give up. And what we have here is a character in the story whose own circumstances and actions remind us to do what Jesus said on the tin at the beginning of the parable: always pray and do not give up. Look how she speaks boldly in the face of corruption. She is so tenacious. The unjust judge gives up because he fears that she will come and attack him. Yes, he, the strong male judge, fears the widow. In fact, the Greek word for attack here is one taken from the world of boxing. It means to beat. Paraphrasing it, you could say that the judge is dreading the widow giving him a black eye. The world sees a poor, defenceless widow. The judge sees Tyson Fury. Perhaps we too feel weak and feeble in the face of wickedness and suffering in our world. Certainly our opponents love to construe us this way. But a church that is bold to keep praying, even in the face of unequal relationships and insurmountable odds, is not a pushover. One of my favourite illustrations of this mindset, I quote occasionally, comes from C.S. Lewis's brilliant book, Screwtape Letters. So if you don't know the book, Screwtape is a senior devil, and he's writing letters to his nephew Wormwood, who is a junior tempter. And in one of the letters, Screwtape writes this: "One of our great allies at present is the church itself. Do not misunderstand me. I do not mean the church as we see her, spread out throughout all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. That, I confess, is a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. But fortunately, it's quite invisible to these humans. All your patient sees is the half-finished sham Gothic erection on the new building estate. When he goes inside, he sees the local grocer, with rather an oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. When he gets to his pew and looks around him, he sees just that selection of his neighbours whom he has hitherto avoided. In our ministry of intercessory prayer, we may present as a poor widow, but we are, in fact, an army terrible with banners. We are the Tyson fury of all things spiritual. That's why we should always pray and not give up. Nevertheless, bold as we may be with our prayers, God is still playing the long game, and we don't always see our prayers answered. I pray regularly that God will bring to naught various wicked regimes around the world that inflict persecution on their populations. But I haven't seen it happen yet. I long for regimes to fall in China, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Mexico, Vietnam and other nations. I watch and I pray, longing for the day. So how in the meantime do we cope with unanswered prayer? If God is so unlike the unjust judge and promises a quick administration of justice, why are things still bad? Why have these evil governments, for example, still retained power? I've found a response by Pete Greig, the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement, as a stimulating one in considering this. In the midst of seeing many wonderful answers to prayer in the early days of 24/7, amazing stories he could tell, Greg was not experiencing the same in his family life, because his wife Sammy had been having terrible epileptic seizures, and pray as many people did, she wasn't healed. His prayers for his own beloved wife seemed to go unanswered. Much of his wrestling with that painful dilemma you can find in a brilliant book of his called God on Mute. But he gives a shorter account in a YouTube video where he describes 3 reasons why we don't always see the answers to prayer that we desire. The first reason he calls God's world. In other words, the laws of nature. He talks about how because God has set up a creation that works consistently according to reliable laws, then miracles must, by definition, be rare occurrences. Excuse me. C.S. Lewis again said that you would no longer be able to rely on those laws in good ways if every time something painful was about to happen, those laws got suspended. Suppose, says Lewis, that every time a Christian dropped a hammer, that God answered the prayer for the hammer not to hit the toe. Well, if God kept doing that, we would be walking around in a world where we could no longer rely on gravity. We would be making our way every day through loads of hammers floating in the air. One preacher I heard described scientific laws as being descriptions of God's habits. Miracles happen occasionally when God changes his habits. But these occasions really are occasional. Otherwise, the many good things that follow from having predictable laws of nature would fall apart. So, sometimes these things are a natural consequence of God's world. A second reason Pete Greig gives is for prayer being unanswered is God's will. There are many ways in which we do know God's will, not least how to live ethically as Christians. Most of that's fairly clear. But there are other ways where we shall not always know God's will, and where his ways are not our ways. His ways are higher than ours. No mere human being knows the entire will of God. Perhaps you thought once that it was God's will that you married a particular person, but in fact it turned out to be unrequited love. How many of us look back on things like those in our lives and actually are glad that life didn't pan out the way we had hoped at the time. God did something better for us, but we could not have seen it at the time. And so our initial prayers went unanswered. It may have been painful at the time. It may be something we can only appreciate with hindsight. But sometimes God overrules or ignores our prayer requests because he has a better outcome in mind than we can anticipate. So, recapping, God's world, with our need to rely on the laws of nature, is one reason we don't always see answers of prayer. God's will, which isn't always something we can see, is another reason he may not give us what we ask for. And the third and final reason that Pete Greig describes in this YouTube video, keeping with the W's, is God's war. There is opposition to God's ways. There is a spiritual conflict. I don't say that to blame everything on demons, but I am saying that human beings actively choose to do things that are opposed to the will of God. From small acts of selfishness to large-scale acts of violence. Jesus may be reigning at the right hand of the Father, but there are still forces arrayed against his kingdom. Just as we now have King Charles III on the throne, but there are still criminals at work in our society. Well, what should we do in these circumstances? Why? We should pray all the more boldly for God to overcome his enemies. It may take a long time, but it is worth the investment in prayer. Indeed, in the face of all that we encounter in creation that is not according to God's purposes of love, let us be bold in prayer. The weak widow is but a disguise for the spiritual heavyweight boxer. Spiritually speaking, we can punch above the widow's weight. And if we do, then, to answer the final question Jesus asks in that passage, yes, the Son of Man will find faith on the earth. May he find it in each of us. Amen. That's enough for this week. Just to say there will not be a video next week. I'm taking a week off. So next video is due to appear on this channel on Sunday, October the 30th. Thanks for being here this week. Please like, subscribe, share the video and all those things. Thanks for being with me. God bless you all. Bye-bye.